And this is my uncle Yosiya, and we're at my grandparents' house in Kampala. And he is an author, so he's written some books. And he lives in Kampala currently. So we're just gonna ask him a few questions. So the first question is, what inspired you to be an author?
I guess what I could say inspired me to be an author is growing up, because I grew up in the era when penmanship was key. There weren't any computers and everything. So I just fell in love with putting words down on paper to create a story. Then I guess and this was about 8, 9 years old. Then I forgot all about it until probably my junior year in high school. I wrote a book report, and I got great feedback from my English teacher. And so it's just something I always knew I wanted to do. I didn't really have time to do it until I came back to Uganda, and there was more time for me to write, because it's a time-consuming thing. But I think I've always wanted to be a writer because I just loved writing, and I loved words on paper and just the whole feel of it. And I realized that the best way for me to express myself in that way is just by telling stories.
Were you exposed to the African literary canon in high school? And if not, why do you think that is?
Let me see. Definitely not. Definitely not. I started high school in the States, New England, North Dakota. St. Mary's, so it was a very religious-oriented school for 2 years, and then I did 2 years in Wilbraham and Munson. So I mean, I guess for obvious reasons, we really weren't. You know, there was British literature and American literature primarily that I was exposed to.
So why do you think, like, in American, like, the American education system, that we're not, like, exposed to African literature, or, like, usually you're not, or any, like, global literature, really?
It's hard to say. I'd say probably stereotypes and biases. A lot of people, what they're exposed to on TV, and you have to realize that when I was growing up, the internet really wasn't big like this. So you couldn't actually go Google and do your own research and stuff like that. So what you're exposed to was watching TV on CNN. And so I think people believe that by watching TV they get the full scope of the African story, and there's nothing more to learn. A lot of people, and this is 9th, 10th, 11th grade actually, I don't know if they still do, but thought Africa was a country. You know, so Africa is very diverse, and but I don't know why. I couldn't really tell you why. I certainly wasn't exposed to it.
Okay. The next question is, so you recently wrote a book. So I just want to talk about, like, your target audience. Like, who are they? And when you were writing, who did you want? Just who were you speaking to?
Even when I grew up in Africa, I went to international schools, American schools. So then after that, 9th grade, 15 years old, went to the States, boarding school and all that. So that was my target audience. Primarily people of African descent, either born in Africa, whose parents are born in Africa, who have traveled abroad and maybe come back. And I felt I wanted to tell that story because when you go to the States, when I went to the States, for example, okay, my accent wasn't a typical African accent or whatever, but I was still African, you know, so I'm kind of alienated in that respect. When you come back to Africa, of course the accent is a bit American, so you're not necessarily, so I felt there was this divide for people in the middle, and I just felt that's the story I wanted to tell. I didn't have a target audience in mind necessarily, but if I was to say a demographic, I was probably thinking 30 and up, 30 years old and up, because that's how old I was when I started writing. But what I also realized at the same time as reading and writing books is, and so that's what I did. Particularly when I wrote the book, it took me, I'd say, 10 days to do the first draft. I was just putting my thoughts down on paper and everything. The editing process and the fact gathering process was the longer part of it. So throughout that process, what I realized is that when you write, you don't want to necessarily target anybody. You just want to tell your story the best way you can, put it out there, and then, you know, collect your demographics and see who actually bought it. So then maybe for the second book you can use it. But so basically just writing it, I just said, you know what, I'm going to write from the heart. The one thing I did though when I was writing is I always had visuals in mind, you know, so every scene I could actually see it.
Mm-hmm.
So that's as far as I was doing in terms of pre-planning, but I didn't really have a target audience.
Should you say the title of the book?
I just think, yeah, I'll talk to you about that after. I'm just going to move on to my last question.
Okay.
As a writer, as an African writer, do you feel obligated to write about post-colonial or colonial Africa?
It's crazy because, like I told you when I wrote, I was just writing the story. I wasn't preconceived anything. But when I went through the book, I realized that I did feel somewhat obligated because that's what it was.
Yeah.
And maybe because there's a lot of misrepresentation that's gone on along the facts, or maybe that's because that's not the era I grew up in, but that's the era that influenced my father's movements and eventually made me who I am. So that's what I know best at that point. So yes, the books I have written have that element to them.
Yeah.
So I mean, I don't consciously feel obligated, but that's how it winds up.
Yeah. And then, what is your message to like contemporary or up and coming African writers? What do you want them to know?
Don't let anybody put you in a box. Just because you're an African writer, it doesn't mean you have to have an African theme. You can write science fiction. And so don't put yourself in a box and say, I'm an African writer. We're all writers. You're a writer. Be as broad as you want to be or as specific as you want to be. Don't limit yourself.
Yeah. Cool. All right.
All right.